This is the Fujifilm X100VI. It is the successor to the ever popular X100V. And here are the reasons I think this camera is so stinking popular and why it might actually be worth the hype. Now, this camera is on loan to me, but I do have one on pre-order without any sort of discount or anything like that. And I've owned multiple iterations of the X100 series dating all the way back to the original X100 from, I don't know, 10 plus years ago. I have plenty of videos on the X100V on this channel, and obviously, yeah, I'm picking this camera up, and here is why you probably should too. Now, right off the bat, this camera is beautiful. Objectively, it is a good looking camera. If you put this thing right here and then look at it next to my Leica M11, this is a $9,000 camera, plus you have to buy a lens as well. This thing comes in at $1,600, which is not cheap, but obviously they have some pretty clear design cues. They look very similar and give a relatively similar experience as far as a subject or someone who might be seeing you out taking photos. If they see someone with an offset viewfinder, rangefinder style camera like this to a subject, it's going to look very, very similar to something like this. Obviously, people that know things about photography are going to know that this is a Leica and this is a Fujifilm camera. But for the vast majority of people, it just is a beautiful little object. It's something that is inspiring, and in the way that Apple products are made to be beautiful and inspiring like that, right? It just does the same thing. When I see this on a table, it makes me want to pick up and use it. And so, I mean, right off the bat, just the fact that this thing is designed so well and is a thing that you actually want to pick up and use makes a lot of sense. Now, lots of cameras can make an image like this camera can, but not a lot of other things can make it in a package that is so compact and doesn't require you to choose a bunch of things. I think that a lot of people out there, the reason why buying an interchangeable lens camera might not be the best thing is this idea of the paradox of choice. The idea that when I am going to bring in my Leica somewhere, I have to choose, am I going to bring a 28 millimeter, a 35 millimeter? Am I going to bring a 35 f2? Am I going to bring a 35 1.4? Am I going to bring a 50 millimeter, a 40 millimeter? There's just lots of options. Where this thing, yes, you can put a wide angle converter like the WCL or something, but for the vast majority of people, they're going to buy this camera, they're going to have a 35 millimeter equivalent, and they're going to just be forced to use those limitations as a source of creativity. You have to make the images you want with a singular lens and a singular focal length, which is fantastic. Now, if you've watched some of my recent videos on the Ricoh GR system, obviously this camera is larger than those, but you can still put it in larger pockets. I mean, I didn't even think about this, but I could fit it in this pocket right here. So if you're wearing like a shirt jacket kind of thing, you can fit in a lot of those. You can fit it in a jacket pockets. For the most part, it's definitely going to be smaller than most other cameras, but it is going to be more of an intentional thing than just popping your phone out. You're going to bring this camera along for the most part to take images. So it's going to be a little bit different than some other cameras that might be more pocketable, but obviously they are much, much, much smaller, lighter, all those kind of things. Now, for the person that is just like a photography enthusiast, not a professional, but you like photography, I think this is a very, very, very good camera. It comes in at a price point where most people, if they want to kind of splurge on a camera like this, you can afford relatively in comparison to a lot of other systems. Now, your money might be much better spent on a camera like this, but I think that a lot of people that get into photography, a huge barrier is just the fact that you have to actually like pick up a camera like this and use it and bring it places. And I think a lot more people are going to be more likely to bring a smaller, more compact, a camera that you look at and go, I want to bring that with me, versus something like this. Most people aren't going to bring this with them like out with friends, where I think a camera like this a lot of people are going to bring this out with friends. I think that another huge thing about this camera is that it has the built-in flash. So you can bring it out with friends. You can turn it on the flash mode and just take some basic fun photos of an event, a kid's birthday party, a night out to the bar, whatever. This camera works really well for something like that. And in my travels, even as a professional, I have found that bringing something like this is really, really nice because it is small. Again, it kind of fits with the whole travel aesthetic. You know, if you want to be all Instagrammy and stick this next to your passport and take a Instagram stories photo, it fits all of that kind of like travel look of things. And then obviously a huge part for a lot of people is just going to be the film simulations. So, I mean, I actually shoot film, obviously, and I don't think that they look like film necessarily, but they give you a much better look straight out of camera if you want to just shoot the JPEGs. They are much better than almost every other company out there of just giving you lots of fun little options. And I know a lot of people that buy this camera, they figure out a JPEG recipe of sorts, and they make stuff simply on JPEG on this camera and really like it. Personally, I use these cameras where I often will shoot black and white on JPEG and then color on RAW. And a lot of times I do like the JPEGs that come out of this in black and white. I still haven't figured out a good color workflow for this, but that's probably just because I'm a snob in that way, I guess. Another thing about this is just the fact that the auto modes work really, really well. The way that I use this camera is I just stick it at f2. I put it on auto ISO, I put it on auto shutter speed, and I just take photos. It's very, very simple. I just don't mess with things. The files that come out of here are really good. And for the most part, I do end up using the EVF on here a lot. It makes it pretty easy to see if you're looking through this and you're not getting the image you want, then you can go and adjust things like the exposure compensation here and get a good image. So do I recommend this camera for people who are into photography but aren't necessarily trying to do this as a profession? Absolutely. I have multiple friends of mine who own an X100 series camera, and for the most part, I think a lot of them really, really enjoy it. And I do think it is a better idea to buy something like this because I think that people are going to be more likely to bring it with them than something like the Lumix S5 II is actually something that you can often buy at about the same price point, oddly enough, and it is a objectively better camera in many, many ways. Most people are not going to pick up this camera and bring it with them to kids' birthday parties or to the bar or traveling as much as something like this. And so ultimately, that's why I think a lot of people really should be considering buying this camera, and it is worth the hype in those ways. Now, for those of us who are beyond photography enthusiasts, maybe you are a photographer who is an amateur or part-time or even full-time, I think a camera like this is legitimately a really good use of your resources. As a wedding photographer, I'm often using a couple cameras like this, one on each side. And I would say the vast majority of people that are running some sort of photography business are either working off of legacy DSLR cameras or some modern mirrorless cameras like this. And when you're out photographing and it's work, carrying something like this around is like no big deal at all. It's just part of any other job, right? You're carrying around a slightly larger camera because it is a fantastic tool. I really love these cameras. I obviously love the Sony A7 series. I have used the Canons. All that stuff is great. Oftentimes I will bring cameras like this and it's something like my Leica camera or something else. I just have a lot of other kind of like play cameras in that way than most other people. But I do think something like this is a very, very, very cool option for a lot of reasons. The first of which being that you can just use this as an auxiliary camera during getting ready stuff. You can get it during cocktail hour. I know that for sure, walking up to a potential subject, especially like kids or people during cocktail hour at a wedding where you're just kind of moseying around, photographing strangers, just interacting in their natural environment. If you're walking up with this little thing in front of your face, it gives people a very, very different perception than if I'm walking up and taking photos like this, Like this gives you that like professional feel, which is great. Like it's fantastic to have professional tools. But when I'm walking up and taking someone's photo like this, it's a lot more intimidating than me just walking around and having the little camera like this around my neck and just kind of snapping photos. You go from the person that is there to cover an event and more serious and all those kind of things to like maybe a couple's friend that went to art school or whatever, you know, you're just there to like take some snapshots versus photographs, right? And people don't necessarily need to know that this camera actually produces really, really fantastic images. And so I do feel like the perception of other people when you have a camera like this around your neck is just a lot different. You get a more artistic kind of like vibe to yourself, which can be beneficial. Another reason why I think a lot of professionals should own a camera like this simply is because it is about the best backup camera that you could have. So I always recommend having two like pro bodies. So, you know, having like two S5 IIs or two A7 IVs or two R6 Mark IIs or whatever. But then having something like this, oftentimes for me, it's just around my neck because it doesn't weigh very much or anything. Let's say that one of your cameras fails. A 35 millimeter focal length is going to be very, very good for a lot of things. And it is a very, very cheap and easy way, relatively, right? Like $1,600 isn't cheap, but in terms of professional camera bodies, you can easily buy something like this from Square Hood and put a hood and then another filter on here to make this thing fully weather sealed. And if I am out in the pouring rain and I need to get some photos, I would much rather put these in a bag and then just pop this little guy out and take some photos in adverse conditions. And again, a 35 millimeter focal length is going to do the vast majority of things for coverage. I could definitely shoot this as a only camera if I really had to at a wedding. And having something like this, even just as a fail-safe in case your other cameras break, is a very, very good idea. Another thing I really love about this is that it is a little bit different than a lot of other tools. One of the ways that I like to use this camera is just by using the optical viewfinder. And so instead of looking at a screen, it gives me a break where I'm not actually looking at a screen anymore and I'm looking through an actual viewfinder here. So in doing this, yeah, you have to trust the camera a little bit more, but also like I'm able to kind of disconnect from a very like computery feel to photography. And it gives me something that's a little bit different of an experience, which I really enjoy. And then one of the things that I do like about this as well is it can just give you something else that gives some more style to your images. So whether you want to put some diffusion filters on this, whether you want to drag the shutter and do the whole motion blur trend, whatever you want to do, it's very easy with this camera to do that, especially because it has a built-in ND filter. So you can pop the ND filter on and be able to turn your shutter speed way down. So it's an easy way where you don't have to be flipping through your settings on your primary cameras. If you want to embrace a trend like the motion blur thing, you can just shoot those motion blur things on this camera all day long and still maintain all the rest of your settings on your primary cameras. And so it can be just another creative outlet for you to do something different. And you still have your primary cameras, you have this, and it's one of those things where you can use this camera. If nothing turns out, not a big deal because you're just using it as a fun kind of creative tool. So again, if you follow this channel at all, it probably shouldn't be a surprise that I am a big fan of this camera and do legitimately recommend it to a lot of people. But what are your thoughts? Obviously, it's not a cheap camera necessarily, but I think for what it does at its price point, it is absolutely worth the money. And I legitimately do think that a lot of people would benefit from having one. So thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. I will put links to this camera as well as the X100V if you want to try to check one of those out on the used market. And obviously you can jump on and pre-order one of these if it's not already out by the time this video comes out. Subscribe if you haven't already, and you can check out my original videos on the X100V here. One's on the X100VI up here, and I'll see you in one of those videos.